All right, so our next unit is talking about cattle, cotton, railroads, and oil in Texas history. So for today and for the next few lessons, our objective or agenda is going to be to learn about the evolution of cattle, cotton, and railroads, including the boom and bust cycles and the beginning of urbanization in Texas. So today, our first lesson is over longhorn cattle. And our big ideas, Kate, or questions that we're going to be hopefully answering are how were longhorn cattle adapted for life in Texas? What happened to the demand for beef during and after the Civil War? And then hopefully once this lesson is over, we'll be able to describe the routes of the Goodnight Loving and Chisholm trails in Texas. And whenever we get to that part, I will kind of explain what those are to you guys. Some vocabulary that we need to know are branded, chuck wagon, drover, and open range. So here are the vocabulary words and their definitions. Branded, K, just means marked or burned with the hide of they burned the hide of the longhorn cattle with hot iron rod in shapes of their personal symbols or brand. Okay, I tried to draw my dad's right there, but then I remembered I actually have a brand, and this is what it looks like. Okay, so they would light this part not on fire, but they would stick it into some really hot coals, and theirs would be much bigger and much longer than what mine is, but this is essentially what it would look like. So that part would be really, really hot, okay? And then they would usually pick the hind end of the cattle, and they would put it on their behind, okay? And they would burn it into there. They would have to hold it on there, okay? And they would burn it into the hide of the cow. So this is, I got this in college. I went to West Texas A&M University. So that's kind of what a brand, okay, or brander looks like. Our next word is chuck wagon. Okay, chuck wagon is just a type of wagon that carried food and cooking supplies. Then we have a drover, which is a cattle driver operator. And then open range, which just means unfenced land. And that posed a problem because there was no way to keep the cattle in one place. And I will have pictures of these come up in just a second on what those exactly are, so you can see. All right, so now let's get into it, okay? The period in Texas history between 1865 and 1900 is known as the cattle, cotton, and railroads era. The cattle industry in Texas actually began in the 1500s when the Spanish explorers traveled through Texas with their horses and cattle. Later, when the Spanish mission system started in Texas, herds of cattle were moved from north from Mexico to supply beef and dairy products to missions in the Rio Grande and San Antonio River valleys. In 1836, big year for Texas, when Texas declared its independence from Mexico, many Mexicans abandoned their ranches and returned to Mexico. Texans claimed the cattle for themselves and established their own ranches. Americans who entered Texas from the United States brought their herds of cattle with them to graze on prairie grasses in Central and South Texas. All land in Texas was open range or unfenced, so there was no way to keep cattle in one place. Cattle owners instead branded or marked their cattle by burning them with hot rods. Some cattle that arrived in Texas with Spanish explorers and missionaries escaped and ran into the wild. Over time, they mixed with English cattle brought by settlers from the United States and grew into huge herds that spread across the western plains. These cattle, known as longhorns because of the shape of their huge horns, were lean, strong animals that could survive in any kind of weather with little water. Their long legs allowed them to travel great distances, and their horns protected them from predators that included mountain lions and wolves. Demand for beef. When the Civil War started, the demand for beef increased. The Confederate Army depended on Texas to feed its troops. Texans stopped growing cotton and raised more cattle to meet the demand. After Union troops blocked trade from Confederate states like Texas, there wasn't anyone to eat the huge supply of beef raised by ranchers. By the end of the Civil War, millions of longhorns roamed freely throughout the state. They belonged to anybody who was brave enough and fast enough to catch them. Slavery had ended, and cotton plantation owners were suddenly without free labor for planting and picking cotton. Many farmers had to find new ways to make money and feed their families. They turned their attention to the millions of longhorn cattle running wild in Texas. Cattle drivers. Ranchers hired white, Mexican, and black cowboys to chase, rope, and brand cattle. This was not an easy task, as the horns of some of these huge animals measured 8 feet from point to point. Demand for beef in Texas was limited because of the state's small population. In the rest of the United States, however, demand for beef was high. Ranchers realized they couldn't make any money unless they could sell their cattle to other states. Since there weren't any railroads in Texas, the only way to move cattle north to railroad centers in the Midwest was to ride behind them on horseback while cattle walked along dusty trails. The largest cattle drivers moved more than 200 heads. A head is just one cow. That's the cowboy term for one cow. So more than 200 cows or heads of cattle north at one time. Life on the trail. Some ranchers moved their own cattle north, but most hired a drover, vocabulary word, or a cattle driver operator. A typical cattle drive had 8 to 12 cowboys on horses to help move and care for 2,000 to 3,000 cattle. A wrangler cared for the crew's horses. A cook, often nicknamed Cookie, was one of the most important and best paid men of the crew. Cookie traveled ahead of the herd to have meals ready for when the rest of the crew arrived. A breakfast of coffee, bacon, beans, and biscuits was served as soon as the sun came up. After traveling 15 to 20 miles, the evening meal included beef, dried pork, or stew made from cow brain, heart, kidneys, liver, and tongue. Although Cookie didn't care for cattle or horses, he was expected to do other jobs besides cook meals. He repaired equipment, nursed sick crew members, cut hair, and acted as banker, doctor, and sometimes even dentist, pulling rotten teeth. Cattle drives were difficult and dangerous. To meet tight deadlines, some cowboys rode 24 hours at a time and slept in their saddles. For their work, most cowboys earned about $300 per year. Bad weather, water shortages, prairie fires, and cattle rustlers were all part of a cowboy's day on the trail. The Goodnight Loving Trail. Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving became famous for herding thousands of longhorn cattle from Texas to Wyoming. In 1866, the price for cattle in Texas was very low. Goodnight and Loving searched for a place where they could charge a higher price for their longhorn cattle. They discovered that by traveling to Army posts and Indian agencies in New Mexico, they could get 8 cents a pound for their beef. In spring of 1866, Goodnight and Loving began herding cattle north from San Angelo, along a route that later became known as the Goodnight Loving Trail. They hired 18 cowhands, including famous gunfighter Clay Allison and one-armed Bill Wilson. Goodnight is responsible for building the first chuck wagon, a type of wagon that carried food and cooking supplies. Each chuck wagon formed one piece of a wagon train along the trail. The Goodnight Loving Trail became one of the Southwest's most heavily used cattle trails. So as we can see, it goes from San Angelo all the way up here to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And we cross state lines right here in New Mexico territory, which was still just territory, wasn't a state at that time. The Chisholm Trail. The Chisholm Trail was one of the most famous routes for driving cattle from Texas to Kansas. The Chisholm Trail started in San Antonio and ran through Austin and Fort Worth before crossing into Indian Territory and ending in Abilene or Ellsworth, Kansas. And we can see that right here from San Antonio. Probably went straight right through Denison too, and then went right into Ellsworth and Abilene, Kansas. There's also an Abilene, Texas. You're not crazy. Cowboys spent weeks on the trail guiding their herds by day and camping under the stars at night. It took 3 months for a trail boss, 10 cowboys, a cookie, and a horse wrangler to herd 2,500 cattle along the Chisholm Trail. Each longhorn cow that made the trip successfully was worth 60 to 75 cents. In 1871, the biggest year for the Chisholm Trail, 600,000 longhorn cattle were herded to Kansas. Cattle were loaded onto railroad cars and taken to cities in the eastern part of the United States.